This is the story of a material that chemists cannot easily dissolve, that ordinary bacteria cannot break down in less than several weeks, and that the poultry industry produces by the millions of tons every single year. And that material is a chicken feather, light enough to drift across a factory floor on a single breath of air. Right now, on processing lines from Georgia to Guangdong, a machine strips the feathers off a slaughtered bird in under a second. And for most of the last century, almost everyone treated whatever came off that machine as garbage. Burned in incinerators, buried in landfill pits, worth less than the dirt it got dumped into.
Then, a handful of researchers found out why the feather refuses to rot in the first place. It is roughly 91% of one of the toughest structural proteins in nature. And once you know how to take that protein apart, the same stubborn fiber can become livestock feed, a liquid crop fertilizer, a biodegradable plastic film, a wall of home insulation, or a spool of material for a 3D printer. This is the story of how the poultry industry's most overlooked byproduct is slowly becoming a real industry of its own, spread across at least 4 countries and 70 years of research. And why, in at least one documented case, that byproduct came back carrying secrets from the very birds it was plucked from. Start with how many birds are actually involved. In 2024, the world slaughtered roughly 74 billion chickens for meat, according to data compiled from FAO and OECD sources. A figure the same agencies project will climb past 85 billion a year by 2032.
That single year of chicken production, 2024, yielded about 103.7 million metric tons of broiler meat worldwide. The United States alone produced around 21 million metric tons of that broiler meat in 2023, making it the single largest national producer on Earth. Brazil followed at roughly 14.9 million metric tons the same year and shipped more than $14 billion of frozen poultry overseas in 2024, the largest poultry export total of any country. China sits in the same top tier of producers and separately leads the world in eggs, laying more than 600 billion of them in a single year, a second, smaller feather stream from hens that are never slaughtered for meat at all, running quietly alongside the broiler industry's much larger one. None of those birds leave the processing line with their feathers on.
Feathers commonly make up somewhere between 5 and 7% of a chicken's live body weight. And once you run that percentage against the actual scale of global meat production, the resulting number is enormous and, it turns out, surprisingly hard to pin down with confidence. Work the math forward from 2024's 103.7 million tons of dressed meat, correct for a typical dressing yield of around 72% to estimate live weight. Then take 6% of that for feathers, and the number that falls out is close to 8.6 million metric tons of feathers generated worldwide in a single year. A separate estimate, built the same way from smaller 2019 production volumes, lands at somewhere between 4.7 and 5.9 million tons, consistent with the same method applied to an industry that was, at the time, meaningfully smaller. Even the European Union's own reported feather waste total for 2020, about 3.2 million tons, sits in the same rough proportion once you account for the EU's share of global chicken production. Put a shape on 8 or 9 million tons. The Empire State Building weighs approximately 365,000 tons. Divide the world's annual feather output by that figure, and you get something close to 23 Empire State Buildings, built entirely out of chicken feathers, regenerated from scratch every single year. It is worth being precise about which feathers this story is even about. The soft, stalkless down clusters used in premium pillows and duvets come mostly from ducks and geese, and already have an established, valuable bedding market of their own. The feathers at the center of this story are the ordinary, quilled body feathers that cover a chicken, which carry far less insulating value and have historically had no comparable market waiting for them at all, which is exactly why they piled up as waste instead. The number gets genuinely strange once you go looking for confirmation, though. Plenty of sources circulating online claim a wildly different figure: 40 million tons, incinerated every year, sometimes repeated as high as 1 billion tons or more, while at least one academic paper on the opposite end cites a global total closer to 800,000 tons. Line all of those numbers up next to each other, and they span more than an order of magnitude, all describing the same supposedly well-documented waste stream. The biggest figures don't survive contact with basic arithmetic. If the whole world produced only 103.7 million metric tons of chicken meat in 2024, feathers cannot possibly outweigh that entire meat supply by several multiples. Yet that's exactly what a 40 million ton or billion ton feather figure would require. Nobody tracking this waste stream from farm to landfill seems to fully agree on the real number, which is itself a small, telling fact about how little attention this material has historically gotten. An industry can generate millions of tons of something every year and still not bother to count it carefully. The processing side of the industry is concentrated in a handful of specific places too. In China, more than 70% of the country's keratin manufacturers are clustered in Guangdong province, processing waterfowl feathers, chicken and duck both, specifically for their keratin content. That kind of clustering isn't unusual for a byproduct industry, because raw feathers are wet, bulky, and start degrading almost immediately. The plants that process them tend to sit right next to the slaughterhouses producing them, rather than getting shipped any real distance in their raw form. There's also a supply-side vulnerability baked into this entire industry that has nothing to do with chemistry at all. Highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAI, more commonly known as bird flu, has led to the death or culling of more than 630 million poultry worldwide between 2005 and 2024, with a single peak year, 2022, accounting for 146 million birds across 84 countries and territories. Europe alone lost roughly 50 million birds to culling between October 2021 and September 2022. In the United States, more than 82 million birds across 48 states have been culled since the current outbreak began in 2022, including over 73 million egg-laying hens as of August 2024, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture paid poultry producers more than $500 million in compensation in 2023 alone. Every one of those culled birds is a bird that never reaches a processing line to have its feathers collected in the first place, which means the raw material feeding this entire feather economy can shrink overnight for reasons that have nothing to do with demand for feather products at all. What is not in dispute is what happens to almost all of the feather material that is collected. The overwhelming majority of the world's chicken feathers are either incinerated, buried in landfill, or processed into the cheapest, lowest value product available. And by most accounts, less than 1 in every 10 tons of feathers produced worldwide gets put to any use beyond that. 90% of a multi-million ton annual waste stream, sitting almost untouched. That gap between how much exists and how little of it gets used is where this story actually starts. To understand why feathers pile up instead of simply rotting away, you have to look at what a feather is actually made of. Roughly 91 to 93% of a chicken feather, by weight, is keratin, the same structural protein family that makes up hair, horn, hoof, and fingernail. Keratin earns its toughness through an unusually dense internal architecture. Long protein chains locked together by disulfide bonds, sulfur-to-sulfur links between paired cysteine amino acids, reinforced further by hydrogen bonding and tightly packed hydrophobic regions. Picture the difference between a single strand of loose yarn and the same yarn woven, knotted, and welded to itself at hundreds of points along its length. That second structure is roughly what a keratin chain looks like next to an ordinary digestible protein. The result is a molecule that is essentially insoluble in water, resistant to the digestive enzymes that break down almost every other protein a chicken eats: trypsin, pepsin, papain, and largely ignored by ordinary soil bacteria. Left alone in soil under natural conditions, a feather can take several weeks just to show meaningful breakdown, and full decomposition runs much longer than that. That resistance is precisely the design's whole point in a living bird. A feather has to survive wind, rain, sunlight, and friction for months at a time without falling apart. So evolution built it to be nearly indestructible. The same property that keeps a flying bird's feathers intact for an entire season becomes an environmental liability the moment tens of billions of birds a year get plucked and the feathers get thrown in a pile. Landfilled feathers decompose anaerobically, releasing methane, a gas with roughly 28 times the warming power of carbon dioxide over a 100-year time frame, and closer to 80 times over 20 years, according to the IPCC's own figures, while also carrying a real risk of soil and water contamination wherever that pile happens to sit. Incinerated feathers release sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and fine particulates into the air, the same pollutants regulators try to limit from far more visible industrial sources. Multiply either outcome by tens of millions of birds processed every single day, worldwide, and a material that seems almost weightless in your hand becomes a genuine industrial waste management problem, on the same order as any other byproduct stream regulators actually track. And even where feathers do get repurposed, keratin's stubbornness follows them there too. Raw, untreated feather protein is only about 5% digestible to a farm animal, meaning that, fed straight, a feather delivers almost none of the protein locked inside it. You can grind a feather into powder and dump it in a feed trough, and the animal eating it will pass most of that protein straight through, unused, the same tightly bonded structure that resists soil bacteria now resisting a stomach. For decades, that 5% number was effectively the ceiling on what this entire waste stream was worth. Next to nothing, chemically locked away inside a molecule nobody had yet figured out how to open. The first real crack in that ceiling came from a surprisingly unglamorous corner of agricultural science. In 1950, researchers named Brinkley and Vasic published a paper with a title that undersells exactly how much it mattered: Production of a Friable Meal from Feathers. It described, in essence, a way to cook feathers into something an animal could actually digest, using an old, familiar substance in an entirely new way: water. Under conditions keratin had never evolved to survive. Sustained heat and sustained pressure at once. Further feather and poultry byproduct feed research followed through the 1960s, published in outlets like Poultry Science in 1961 and again in 1967, refining exactly how hot, how long, and at what pressure the cook needed to run to get consistent results batch after batch, rather than the inconsistent, partially digestible product early attempts produced. The modern version of that process is almost deceptively simple to describe. Feathers go into a steam pressure vessel, typically run somewhere around 140 to 200 degrees Celsius, at roughly 0.5 to 0.7 megapascals of pressure, for about 30 to 40 minutes. That combination of heat and pressure does something raw digestion never could. It forces enough of keratin's disulfide bonds to break that the tightly wound protein chains start to unwind and fragment, the same welded structure from a moment ago finally coming loose, one bond at a time. The cooked material then gets dried, typically for around 5 hours at 90 to 110 degrees Celsius, and what comes out the other end is called feather meal, a dry, protein-dense powder that looks nothing like the fluffy material that went in, and smells nothing like it either, by every account of the process. The number that makes this genuinely worth doing is the digestibility jump. Raw feather, roughly 5% digestible. Cooked, hydrolyzed feather meal, at least 75% digestible, sometimes measured higher. A 15-fold improvement, achieved with nothing more exotic than a pressure cooker built at industrial scale.
Feather meal, typically running 80 to 85% protein by weight, could now go into livestock feed, pet food, and fertilizer as a legitimate protein source, not a filler nobody's body could use. A material that used to be worth nothing more than its weight in landfill space had, with one process refined over 2 decades, become something a feed mill would actually pay for. That should have been the end of the story. Problem identified, problem solved, waste stream converted to value. It wasn't. Because turning a feather into something digestible is one thing. What that digestible material might also be carrying along with it turned out to be a very different problem. And for decades, nobody had thought to check for it.
In 2012, a team from the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, working with researchers at Arizona State University, set out to answer a question nobody in the feather meal industry had been asked in public before. What else, besides protein, survives that steam pressure cook? Led by researcher David Love, the team collected 12 commercial feather meal samples, sourced from 6 different U.S. states and from China, and screened each one for 59 different pharmaceuticals and personal care product compounds. Every single one of the 12 samples tested positive for antibiotic residues. Somewhere between 2 and 10 different antibiotics detected per sample. 8 of the 12 samples specifically contained fluoroquinolones, a broad-spectrum class of antibiotic important enough in human medicine that its use in U.S. poultry production had already been banned since 2005. The feathers were carrying a drug that, on paper, shouldn't have been anywhere near the birds that grew them. Beyond the antibiotics, the same screening turned up acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol, the antihistamine diphenhydramine, better known as Benadryl, and even trace fluoxetine, the active ingredient in Prozac. A companion study from the same research group went looking specifically for arsenic in feather meal used in retail fertilizer products, and found inorganic arsenic there too, a finding plausibly connected to roxarsone, an arsenic-based poultry drug that was still in limited U.S. use before being phased out around 2011. The mechanism behind this is almost elegant, in an unsettling way. Whatever a bird is given during its life, antibiotics in its water, medication in its feed, doesn't just pass through and disappear. Some fraction gets metabolized and redeposited directly into the growing feather itself, the same way a hair strand can carry a chemical record of what's been in someone's bloodstream for months. The pressure cooker that turns feathers into digestible protein was never designed to filter out anything else riding along inside that protein. It just breaks the keratin open. Whatever chemical history was locked inside the feather when it went in generally comes right back out the other side, just easier for an animal's body to absorb. It's worth being precise about what this study did and didn't show. 12 samples from 6 states and 1 additional country, tested in 2012, is a real finding. Not a rumor, not an urban legend, published and cited in food safety reporting since. But it is not a claim that every ton of feather meal produced today carries the same residues, and no comparably sized follow-up study surfaced in more recent research to confirm whether the picture has changed since regulations and practices shifted after 2012. What it does prove, cleanly, is that turning a stubborn waste material into something useful doesn't automatically make it clean. Cooking keratin apart says nothing about what else was trapped inside it, and for at least one batch of the industry's supposed solution, the answer included banned antibiotics and arsenic. Anyone selling the feather-to-value story as a simple, uncomplicated win has to sit with that finding rather than around it. The trust problem doesn't stop at the lab bench either. In the United States, feather meal, as an ingredient name, doesn't even have an official definition yet from AAFCO, the association that oversees animal feed and pet food labeling standards. A related, more specifically defined ingredient called hydrolyzed poultry feathers exists instead. Some pet food producers have begun marketing feather-derived protein as a novel, sustainable ingredient. Consumer advocacy groups have pushed back, arguing there isn't yet enough long-term safety research to call it appropriate for a dog or cat's entire lifetime diet, and pointing out that feather meal reportedly tastes poorly enough on its own that manufacturers add flavoring agents just to get pets to eat it. None of that is a peer-reviewed finding in the way the Johns Hopkins study is. It's closer to an ongoing industry argument, but it's a second, separate front on which the same underlying question keeps resurfacing. Cooking a feather apart makes it usable. It doesn't automatically make it trusted. Feed and fertilizer turned out to be only the entry-level use for a cooked feather, and the economics of even that entry-level use are stranger than they first look. Because raw feathers are wet, bulky, and begin degrading almost immediately after plucking, they can't be stockpiled or shipped any real distance in their raw state, which is exactly why rendering plants that turn feathers into feather meal are almost always built right next to, or immediately adjacent to, the slaughterhouses generating the raw material. Running that steam pressure autoclave above 140 degrees Celsius takes a continuous, energy-intensive heat source, and at most American and European rendering plants, that heat comes from natural gas. When European energy prices spiked in 2021 and 2022, in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the economics of feather rendering in Western Europe reportedly got measurably worse. And on the supply side, this is an industry that depends entirely on how many birds actually make it to the processing line, which is exactly what avian flu keeps interrupting. On pricing, Recent trade reporting has put hydrolyzed feather meal at somewhere around $580 to $650 per metric ton on a U.S. export basis in early 2026, with prices under upward pressure, specifically because avian flu culling keeps periodically thinning U.S. poultry processing volumes, and with them, the raw feather supply feeding these plants. A byproduct industry, it turns out, inherits every one of its host industry's problems, along with its host industry's waste.
Set next to the feed industry's default protein source, that price is a small surprise in itself. Soybean meal, the world's standard livestock protein feed, traded around $275 to $325 per metric ton in 2025 and 2026, meaning feather meal, a supposed waste byproduct, has recently sold for roughly twice as much per ton as the world's benchmark plant protein. The reason isn't mysterious once you compare the two on protein content alone. Soybean meal runs around 44 to 48% protein, while feather meal runs 80 to 85%. So on a price per unit of actual protein basis, the byproduct is holding its own against the commodity everyone already trusts. Once researchers had a reliable way to break keratin apart at all, the same starting material started showing up in laboratories chasing much more ambitious products than feed, and it turns out, in at least 6 genuinely different directions at once.
The chemical route. Instead of just cooking a feather until it's digestible, researchers dissolve it more completely, using agents like sodium sulfide or newer, gentler methods built around aqueous, deep eutectic solvents. Mixtures designed to pull keratin into solution without the harsh reagents older extraction methods relied on. One 2025 study reported extracting soluble keratin from feathers at an 80.2% yield. That extracted keratin, mixed with a plasticizer like glycerol and sometimes reinforced with a small amount of microcrystalline cellulose, can be cast into a thin bioplastic film. One measured version of that film showed a tensile strength of roughly 3.6 megapascals, in the same rough neighborhood as some existing plant starch-based bioplastics, though not yet a clear improvement on them. A 2025 comparative study specifically pitted keratin-based bioplastics against cornstarch and potato starch versions and found the feather-derived films performing in a broadly similar range. Evidence this branch is a real contender, not just a lab curiosity. A separate, more recent study processing feathers with a deep eutectic solvent reported a 79.97% dissolution rate, yielding peptides described as highly digestible, with amino acid content running 63.9% higher than conventional fish meal, a striking number given that fish meal is exactly the ingredient the aquaculture industry is trying to reduce its dependence on. The biological route. Rather than forcing keratin apart with heat and pressure, a separate line of research uses living organisms to do the same job more gently. Specific strains of keratin-degrading bacteria, various bacillus species among them, along with certain fungi and actinomycetes, produce an enzyme called keratinase that breaks keratin down into amino acids and soluble protein without an industrial pressure vessel at all. The literature describes this route as more energy-conserving than thermal cooking, and the protein it yields as high quality. The trade-off is speed. Left to unassisted natural decomposition, keratin can take several weeks to show meaningful breakdown, which is exactly why researchers keep hunting for faster, more efficient keratinolytic strains suited to industrial timelines, rather than a compost heap's timeline.
The whole fiber route. A feather fiber is naturally hollow, extremely light. One measured density comes in at just 0.8 grams per cubic centimeter, and surprisingly strong for its weight. Properties that make it a promising building block for non-woven material, essentially matted fiber sheets rather than woven fabric. Blended at a studied ratio of 50 to 50 with bleached cotton fiber and processed through a needle-punched technique, feather fiber has been turned into absorbent non-woven fabric aimed at products like nursing pads and disposable hygiene items, with researchers crediting the feather fiber's hollow structure for giving the blend better thermal insulation and flexibility than cotton or wool alone. Pressed and thermally bonded on its own into insulation panels, feather fiber nonwovens have measured better than some commercial insulation materials in specific hot air and cold air performance tests.
The same fiber sheets show up as geotextiles in civil engineering projects, laid into slopes and embankments for erosion control and drainage. Laboratory testing on these feather-based geotextiles has recorded over 91% mass loss within 24 weeks once buried. And field trials have shown up to 266% more seedlings taking root compared with bare, untreated soil. And as oil spill absorbent material, since feather fiber is naturally hydrophobic and readily soaks up oil rather than water. On a more institutional scale, a European Union-funded project called Unlock spent 4 years, from May 2021 to April 2025, developing feathers into biodegradable food packaging meant to directly replace plastic wrap, backed by just over €5 million in EU funding through the Circular Bio-Based Europe Joint Undertaking. The agricultural route. A distinct processing technique called steam explosion, different from the steady steam pressure cooking used for feather meal, subjects feathers to a rapid pressure release that measurably improves how quickly they break down once buried in soil. That single property matters because feed and standard fertilizer uses are, in the research literature's own words, considered low added value, while agricultural biodegradable plastics, mulch films that are meant to be tilled straight into a field at the end of a growing season, specifically need a material that disappears in soil fast. Steam-exploded feather, which also carries usable nitrogen content, is being explored as exactly that ingredient. In a separate but related line of work, feathers processed instead through hydrothermal treatment, roughly 160 to 180 degrees Celsius, held for about 30 minutes, yield a liquid feather protein hydrolysate, rather than a solid meal, and that liquid has been tested directly as a crop biostimulant. Maize treated with a 5% dose showed 3.7 times the chlorophyll, 1.3 times the protein, and 2.3 times the carbohydrate content of untreated plants, while tea plants given a 3 gram per liter dose showed 43% greater shoot dry weight and 70% greater root dry weight than untreated controls, with similar positive results separately reported for patchouli, mung bean, wheat seedlings, and spinach. The frontier route. Researchers have also blended feather fiber and feather powder into biodegradable polymer bases, materials like polybutylene succinate and EcoFlex, to produce filament for ordinary fused deposition 3D printers, trading some mechanical strength for a genuinely biodegradable feedstock. And at the furthest edge of current research sits something closer to speculation than product. Early-stage work exploring feather-derived carbon materials for hydrogen fuel cell and hydrogen storage applications. Lab-scale investigation, not a deployed technology, worth naming because it shows how far a material can travel once someone bothers to ask what it's actually made of, but not worth overstating as something already on the market. A related pilot-scale line of research runs feathers through pyrolysis instead, heating them in the absence of oxygen, to convert the material directly into an energy carrier, an early-stage waste-to-energy approach, rather than an established industrial process. Across all 6 of these branches, feed, chemical extraction, microbial digestion, fiber composites, agricultural biodegradables, and frontier materials, the common thread is the one that made feather meal possible in the first place. Find a way past keratin's disulfide bonds, whether with heat, pressure, enzyme, solvent, or some combination of all 4, and the same material that used to be worth nothing starts being worth figuring out. None of this happened inside a single corporate research lab with unlimited funding. It happened in the kind of scattered, underfunded, small-scale way real material innovation usually does. One lab and one small company at a time, in at least 4 different countries. Richard Wool, a professor of chemical engineering at the University of Delaware, spent years leading a program called Affordable Composites from Renewable Sources, or ACRES, built around a deceptively simple idea. Combine keratin feather fiber with resins made from soybean oil to create composite materials that could substitute for petroleum-based plastics and fiberglass. His team's prototypes ranged from tractor components to circuit boards to a synthetic material marketed as an alternative to leather. In 2013, that body of work earned Wool a Presidential Green Chemistry Challenge Award, one of the more concrete forms of recognition American science offers for turning an overlooked material into something genuinely useful. On the commercial side, a small Missouri company called Feather Fiber Corporation, based in Nixa, built what's described as the first fully operational pilot plant specifically designed to convert raw feathers into feather fiber and a byproduct called keratin quill. In 2004, the U.S. Department of Agriculture recognized that pilot plant with a World's Best Award, and the company marketed its fiber as a sound-deadening material for office cubicle partitions, automotive interiors, and the sleeper cabs of long-haul trucks. Available business records suggest feather fiber never grew past a very small operation. This isn't a story about a company that conquered a market. It's a story about a real, working proof of concept that showed the idea wasn't just theoretical. In London, two students at Imperial College London, Elena Diekman, with a background in biology, and Ryan Robinson in design engineering, founded a company called AeroPowder in 2016, built around a product they called Plumo, a lightweight, biodegradable insulation and packaging material made from waste feathers, aimed squarely at the polystyrene used to keep food and medicine cold during delivery. The idea won the Mayor of London's low-carbon entrepreneur competition, and the company has continued developing feather-based insulation for both building walls and consumer packaging since. As recently as June 2024, the company secured a £150,000 investment from the British Design Fund, a modest sum next to a major industrial deal, but real, recent money, arriving 8 years after two students first floated the idea, which is its own small proof that this isn't a dead-end 2016 headline. And more recently still, in India, an entrepreneur named Radesh Agrahari built a venture called Golden Feathers around exactly the same raw material, upcycling waste chicken feathers into fiber that gets handcrafted into wool-like textiles and paper products. By the 2023 to 24 financial year, the company was reporting revenue of roughly 1.12 crore rupees, and in 2023, it received a 25 lakh rupee grant from the French Embassy in India. Modest sums by the standards of global manufacturing, but real revenue from a real product sold by a business that didn't exist a decade ago. Add the EU's own Unlock packaging project, running until April 2025, with over €5 million behind it, and you get a genuinely international picture. The US, the UK, India, and the EU as a bloc, all independently funding some version of the same bet, without any of them waiting for the others to prove it first.
Two separate forces are pushing this bet from opposite directions right now. One regulatory and one commercial. On the regulatory side, the EU's own landfill directive commits member states to cutting municipal waste sent to landfill down to just 10% by the early 2030s, with an outright ban approaching on landfilling anything that could instead be recycled or recovered. And animal byproducts specifically already face restrictions on export for incineration or landfill. That's a hard deadline pushing the industry away from its default disposal methods, whether or not a better use has been found yet. On the commercial side, the world's aquaculture industry, already straining against the environmental limits of ordinary fish meal, which depends on catching wild fish to feed farmed ones, is projected to need roughly 75% more total feed by 2025 than it did in 2015, climbing from about 49.7 million tons to around 87.1 million tons.
Feather meal, at roughly 80 to 90% protein, and notably rich in the amino acids cysteine, threonine, and arginine, has already been tested as a partial fish meal replacement in tilapia, rainbow trout, Chinook salmon, European sea bass, Indian major carp, coho salmon, and gilthead sea bream, meaning the industry chasing cheaper, less ecologically damaging protein for farmed fish, and the industry sitting on millions of tons of underused feather waste are, increasingly, the same conversation. Zoom out to the market these efforts are trying to break into, and the numbers are still modest by industrial standards. The global keratin products market, which includes wool and hair-derived keratin alongside feather-derived keratin, not feathers alone, was valued at roughly $1.66 billion in 2024 and is projected to reach somewhere around $2.4 billion by 2030, growing at about 6.4% a year.
That's real, steady growth, but it's a modest number next to the scale of the raw materials sitting around waiting to be used, and a genuinely tiny number next to the industry it comes from. The global poultry market itself was worth roughly $360.5 billion in 2023, climbing toward $385.4 billion in 2024. Put the two figures side by side, and the entire worldwide keratin economy, every bioplastic film, every insulation panel, every biostimulant fertilizer batch, is worth less than 0.5% of the industry whose byproduct it's built from. With under 10% of the world's feather waste currently valorized in any way, and China's own keratin processing industry concentrated in a single province, the ceiling on this market is set far higher than where it currently sits. Put the whole chain together, from carcass to product, and the transformation is genuinely large, even if it's still partial.
A material that was, for most of the 20th century, worth less than the cost of hauling it to a landfill is now the raw input for a feed ingredient that lifted its own digestibility from 5% to over 75% through nothing more than heat and pressure. And that same protein-rich meal is now being tested as a direct substitute inside an aquaculture feed market growing 75% in a single decade. For a liquid biostimulant that measurably increased maize chlorophyll content by 3.7 times, and boosted tea plant root growth by 70%. For a bioplastic film now measured against, not dismissed next to, established plant starch alternatives. For insulation panels and absorbent hygiene fabrics that have outperformed commercial materials in specific published tests. For an EU-funded packaging project built to replace plastic wrap outright, backed by regulation that is actively closing off the old landfill option anyway. For geotextiles stabilizing civil engineering projects. For oil spill-absorbent fiber, and for filament running through 3D printers building parts that will eventually biodegrade instead of sitting in a landfill for centuries. 4 countries, at least 6 distinct organizations, and roughly 70 years of accumulated research all converge on the same overlooked material. The gap between what's possible and what's actually happening remains the real headline number. Under 10% of the world's roughly 8 to 9 million tons of annual feather output is currently being put to any of these uses, which means, on the most conservative reading of the numbers in this story, something on the order of 7 to 8 million tons of feathers are still being incinerated or landfilled every single year, releasing methane at nearly 30 times the warming power of carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds at the smokestack, for no reason other than nobody nearby has built the plant to process them yet. That's not a story with a clean, triumphant ending. It's a story about a problem that has been technically solved, repeatedly, in different labs, by different methods, over 70+ years, and still isn't solved at the scale the problem actually exists at, and where even the plants that do exist stay exposed to swings in natural gas prices and to bird flu outbreaks that have nothing to do with the technology itself and everything to do with how many birds even reach the processing line. And even the part that is scaled up carries an asterisk. The 2012 discovery of banned antibiotics and arsenic in a batch of commercial feather meal is a reminder that processed and safe are not automatically the same word. That whatever a farming system feeds its animals has a way of resurfacing later, in a form nobody was necessarily looking for. The ongoing argument over feather meal's place in pet food shows the same tension playing out in public, in real time, without a regulator's definition to settle it yet. The technology to break keratin apart has existed since the 1950s. The technology to guarantee what comes out the other side is entirely clean and entirely trusted is a separate, unfinished problem, and nobody in this story has claimed to have closed it. It's worth remembering that this wasn't always a waste story. For roughly 12 centuries, from the earliest documented use in the 7th century through the early 1800s, a bird feather, usually a goose's, was one of the most valuable pieces of technology a literate civilization had. Quill pens signed the Magna Carta in 1215 and the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. They were the entire physical interface between human thought and the written record for well over 1,000 years, until steel pen points, first mass-produced in 1828, spent the next few decades quietly replacing them because steel didn't need constant resharpening. The feather didn't get less useful between the 7th century and the 20th. Civilization just found something more convenient, and the feather went from indispensable to invisible in the span of a single industrial upgrade. The quill wasn't the only time feathers swung to the opposite extreme of worthless either. By 1886, roughly 5 million wild birds a year were being killed purely to supply feathers for fashionable hats. 3 out of every 4 hats sold were trimmed with plumes, or, sometimes, entire stuffed birds. And the trade pushed species like the snowy egret, the roseate spoonbill, and the great egret toward outright extinction. It took a Boston socialite named Harriet Hemingway, who read one article about the slaughter in 1896, and organized a boycott that grew into the Massachusetts Audubon Society, and then a chain of federal law, the Lacey Act in 1900, a New York state plumage ban in 1910, and finally, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1918, to end it. That's a different feather, from different birds, hunted for a completely different reason than the one this story is about. But it says something that the same basic material has swung, within the span of a single century, from something people were willing to drive whole species extinct to obtain, to something the world now burns and buries by the million tons because almost nobody thought it was worth the trouble of collecting. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that this material sat almost untouched for most of a century, not because nobody was smart enough to use it, but because almost nobody bothered to ask the question in the first place. Keratin's toughness was never a mystery. Feathers have always been keratin, always been disulfide bonded, always been resistant to rot. What changed wasn't the material. It was the number of people, from a Delaware chemistry lab to a Missouri pilot plant, to 2 students in London, to an entrepreneur in India, to a quiet run of microbiologists screening bacteria for the right enzyme, willing to spend a career or a small company's entire existence figuring out how to take it apart. Multiply that pattern across every other byproduct still sitting in a landfill somewhere, worth nothing only because nobody has run the same experiment yet, and the chicken feather stops looking like a strange, niche story. It starts looking like a template for how much value gets thrown away every year, simply because breaking it open takes more patience than anyone has been willing to spend, until, eventually, someone finally is. If you want more stories like this, real waste, real chemistry, real numbers, no invented drama, subscribe to the channel, because the next one is already in the works, and it starts with something almost as unlikely as a chicken feather.